The next step on my 386DX build is to implement code for PAL-1 and PAL-2. And if I look at my board, here's where I have PAL-1 and PAL-2. And PAL is just programmable array logic. Now, Intel is having you use these two chips to do local bus control. Now, on my 286, I would just go out and purchase a bus controller chip. It was a standard Intel chip that I could put in that would manage all of these signals that I need to manage my bus. Well, on the 386DX, instead of having a standard bus controller chip, Intel pivoted to use a pair of these PAL chips, and then you can program on the functionality you want. Now, this diagram doesn't tell me what should happen inside of those chips, though. But what Intel does offer in the back of the hardware reference manual is code in a language called ABLE that basically tells me how to have that chip behave. And basically the code is describing how that chip should behave, how the hardware should behave. And so they give me these two sets of code, and this is just the beginning of the snippets. There are multiple pages long for each one of them. But as I got into this, a challenge is I don't think people have used Able in many years, and the tool set for Able really is tough to find and tough to use. Now, Intel did offer an alternative source code format, which was this PAL-1. Also, with this PAL-1, finding tools is difficult. My preference would be to use a language, a hardware definition language called COUPLE. Still old, but at least I can use a tool called WinCouple and run it on Windows, and I can do my coding, and I can then create a compiled file that I can then burn or write to these chips. So my challenge is, how do I get from either Able to COUPLE or PAL-1 to COUPLE? Or can I directly create the necessary file from an Able tool or a PAL-1 tool that I can write to my two PAL chips? Now, as I go through this, there are a lot of acronyms. This is kind of a crazy level of acronyms as I get into this type of stuff, and I'm learning my way through this, but I did put a blog post out there where I'll update this as I go, but trying to describe what is Able and PAL-1 and COUPLE and some other languages, and what's a PLD and a PAL and a PLA, PSOC, all these other things. A lot of related concepts, but I do have a post out there, and here's the start of that post. I'm not intending that it's readable here, but just a heads up that there is a blog entry out there if you want to read more about some of this stuff. The first thing I attempted was to manually convert the Able code over to COUPLE. And I made some pretty good progress on that, but I ultimately was running into a couple of dead ends. There was a certain part of the syntax I couldn't quite get figured out on how to convert it from Able to COUPLE. And I was also finding that the way I was implementing it wasn't fitting within the constraints of the GAL chip that I was hoping to use. So I set that to the side and said, okay, what if I just simply go out and try to find something where I can directly compile from the Able code into a file, a JED file that I could program to these two PAL chips. So that's what I did. I loaded up a Windows 8 virtual machine, specifically a 32-bit version of Windows 8. And the reason I did that is the tool I want to run will not install on a 64-bit OS. So I had to dig out an old CD and load up Windows 8, specifically 8.1. And I installed this software, but now I can actually change into this folder where I have this software installed, this Able 4. And in that same folder, I have a couple of source files, PAL-1 and PAL-2. And those are just files I created directly referencing the hardware reference manual, that code in the appendix. And this is Able code that I am hoping then to compile into a file that I can program my two chips with. And that file would be a JED file, or an extension of .jed. So here I've got the two source code files, but I now want to go ahead and run this Able 4 And then it pulls up and it's basically a DOS text editor. And from it, I can do an error check and just make sure that there are no errors, and there were not. And then I can tell it to compile. There were not any errors. And then I can actually pull up and look at this JED file, which is what I can then load into my programmer. And then I can leave and come back in and edit this other file, the second PAL file. So that first one you saw was the first PAL. Now I'm going to edit the second PAL file. And I'll do the same thing. I'm going to choose compile and error check. And if there are errors, it would pop up a screen showing me errors. And same with the compile. Those both succeed. And then I look at the resulting JED file. And if I do a directory now at this point of JED files, so you can see I now have these two JED files that I can now work with. And I can just open up one of these outputs in Notepad just so you can see it. This would be the same thing that was shown up in that other tool, but this is then used to help program those specific PAL chips. But this is enough now that I can directly compile the ABLE code provided from Intel using this tool, and then take those JED files and actually write them out to my two PALs. So that's the first way I attempted this. I then took the PALASM source that Intel offers and tried to learn enough about PALASM compared to couple to just manually convert that over, and that's what I did. So here I have a couple version of the PALASM source that Intel had. And I'm editing it in WinCouple, which you can download off of the vendor's website. And from this, I can then go ahead and really go build this JED file. So I'm going to come up here and do a run, and I'll do a device-dependent compile. And it comes back with no warnings, no errors, which is great. And if I go look in the folder where that's at, and I can open up the JED file, this is the second one. This is for the PAL-2, and here's for PAL-1. You know, I can look through what is it that I would use on my programmer. And so again, I should be able to load up this JED file and program that. And there's other files like this, a .doc file. It's not a Word doc, it's just an output. And it kind of shows me, for example, usage. So how many P terms can I use? How many am I actually using on each of the pins and things like that. But at that point, I do have a JED for each of the PALs, PAL-1, PAL-2, and that is in the source code of couple. And that's likely the one I'm going to move forward with. So I'll use the couple code that I've created the JEDs, and I'm going to next program those two PALs, get them in my board, and then see if I'm getting bus control signals that seem reasonable. So that'll be the next step of something that I need to work on.